Chapters 37 and 38 of the third volume by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 37. A Voice from the Grave. It was close on 2:00, and weary of waiting for Claude, the master of the manor house had seated himself at the luncheon table. He was curious to know what had taken place between his friend and Mr. Peyton, as he judged from the length of time the interview had lasted that some important communication must have been made. Had Claude discovered the identity of Peyton with Jerningham? If so, had Jerningham confessed to the crime? These questions so annoyed and perplexed Tait that he could not swallow a mouthful of food. Throwing aside his napkin, he rose from the table to see if Larcher had returned. As he pushed back his chair, the door opened, and Claude, with a roll of papers in his hand, made his appearance. Tait turned to greet him with a smile, but it disappeared from his face and the words died on his lips when he saw the white and haggard countenance of his friend. "Good heavens, man!" he cried, hastening toward him. "What is the matter? Here, sit down. Drink this glass of wine." Claude did as he was bidden, then waved his hand in the direction of Dormer, who, stolid as ever, stood waiting orders. "You can go, Dormer," said Tait hastily. Then, when the man leaving the room closed the door after him, and they found themselves alone, he continued: "Is anything wrong, Claude? Did Peyton tell—" "Not Peyton," said Larcher, finishing his wine and setting down the glass. "There is not such a person." "Aha!" remarked Tait, rubbing his hands. "I thought the name was a feigned one. And who is our friend Mr. Peyton?" "My father." Tait opened his mouth to utter an ejaculation, shut it without doing so, and looked dumbfounded at his friend. What do you mean? Are you mad?" he stammered, sitting down limply. "No, I am not mad," groaned Claude, "though I have suffered enough to make me so. I mean what I say. It was Jerningham who was murdered. Jerningham, who was dressed as Darnley on that night, as was my father. Jerningham, whose corpse was so unrecognizable by decomposition that it was thought to be that of Georges Larcher. My father is alive. My father is hiding here as Ferdinand Peyton. This is his story of the tragedy." He placed the roll of paper in Tait's hands, and poured himself out another glass of wine. Overcome with amazement, the little man looked first at the paper, then at his friend. It was some minutes before he could collect his wits together and speak coherently. "What an extraordinary thing!" he said at length. "You thought both your parents dead, but now it seems they are alive. Your mother at Clarence Cottage, Hampstead; your father at Rose Cottage, Thorston. Did you tell your father that Mrs. Larcher was still in existence?" he asked sharply. "I had no time to do so," said Claude with an effort. "My father placed those papers in my hand, and then confessed who he was. I wished to speak further to him, but he pushed me out of the room, saying, 'Read that confession, and form your judgment before you accept me as your father.' I hardly knew what I was doing till I found myself in the lane outside. Then I came on here. I still feel quite bewildered. I don't wonder at it. Take another glass of wine. Did your—" "Don't ask any questions, Tait," said Claude, rising impatiently. "Read me the confession at once. I can't do it myself. Won't you have some luncheon?" "No. Every mouthful would choke me. I'll lie down on the sofa, and you bring your chair close to me to read." Tait nodded and unrolled the papers, while Claude, filling himself another glass of claret, crossed over to the sofa and lay down thereon. With the glass of wine on the carpet beside him, with the untasted luncheon on the table, he closed his eyes with a weary sigh, and compelled himself to listen. Tait glanced sympathetically at him, then, without remark, though he was burning to speak, smoothed out the paper and began to read slowly. The writing was clear and legible, the matter interesting, so there was no difficulty in deciphering the story of the tragedy as narrated by the man who for 25 years had been supposed to be the victim. The confession, so called, was in the form of a letter from father to son. "Dear Claude, at length I have made up my mind to reveal myself to you, and to set out at length the circumstances which placed me in this position. I am led to do so by 3 things. Firstly, your presence in this neighborhood with the avowed intention of avenging my death. Secondly, The publication of the novel entitled A Whim of Fate, which sets out the particulars of what happened at Horiston in 1866, more or less perverted for fictional purposes. Thirdly, the advice of Francis Hilliston, an old and valued friend, who points out that the only way to stop you in the investigation is to admit my identity, and so do away with your motive, viz., the avenging of my death. On reading this, I leave it to yourself whether you will still consider me your father and visit me accordingly, or whether you will look on me as a guilty man. Till you are acquainted with the truth, so far as I am aware of it, I swear that I will not approach you or open my mouth in your presence. On this understanding, I set forth the following facts as shortly as is consistent with clearness. Judge me as you please, but I declare before God that I am innocent of Jerringham's death, and that I know not who killed him. This for the prologue. And now for the story. You will understand that I wish to cast no aspersions on the memory of your mother. But in the present case it is necessary that I should speak plainly. Your mother and I were ill-suited to one another, and lived unhappily together. Even when in the army I was addicted to literary pursuits, and when I sent in my papers, I devoted myself almost entirely to study. Your mother was gay and social. Being a beautiful woman, she liked admiration, and was never so happy as when out at balls, at the theatre, or at garden parties. She lived in a whirl of excitement, and she quarrelled bitterly with me because I preferred a quieter life. I accompanied her sometimes, but not often enough to please her, and when we came to reside at the Laurels after my leaving the army, she frequently declared that she regretted having given up Mark Jerringham for me. Naturally enough I resented this plain speaking, and we were estranged. Not even your birth could bridge over the abyss between us, and while we lived at the Laurels at Horiston, I believe we were as unhappy and ill-matched a couple as existed in England. It was the quick coupled with the dead, and we both suffered accordingly. The first cause of our unhappiness was, as you see, incompatibility of temper. The second was the presence of Jerringham, who came to Horiston ostensibly on a visit, in reality to stay near my wife. You can easily understand that I resented the presence of this young man. He was remarkably like me in height, figure, and looks, and my wife had a fancy for him before her marriage with me. That she became my wife, she lovingly avowed, was because of my uniform. So far as looks were concerned, there was nothing to choose between Jerringham and myself, but the glitter of the military trappings, so she declared, turned the balance in my favor. You may be sure I liked Jerringham none the more after such a declaration of lukewarm affection from your mother, and when he came to reside at Horiston, 4 years after our marriage, I resented his continued presence about the house. Your mother was angry at my expostulations, and the introduction of this second element of discord into the house estranged us more widely than ever. It was a miserable and most unhappy time. It was my friend Hilliston who pointed out the real reason for Jerringham's visits. This latter was not in love with my wife, but with her maid, Mona Bantry. As Dennis, the brother of Mona, was an old servant of mine, I did not care to speak to my wife on the matter, but to keep the affair quiet, and to save the girl from the anger of her brother, I discouraged the visits of Jerringham on all possible occasions. We had a quarrel in public, and as all the gossips of Horiston knew that he had been fond of my wife before her marriage to me, the quarrel was set down to jealousy on my part. All the neighborhood knew there was bad blood between Jerringham and myself, and, foolishly enough I admit, I made use of several expressions calculated to show my hatred. These heated speeches were afterward remembered and commented upon. Things were in this position when the fancy dress ball took place at Horiston. Hearing that it was to be a masked ball, I resolved to assume a similar dress to that of Jerringham, and learn from my wife's own lips if she still cared for me. You may think I acted in an unworthy manner, but as a matter of fact I was nearly out of my mind with anger and jealousy, and hardly knew what I was doing. My wife was going to the ball as Mary, Queen of Scots, accompanied by Jerringham as Darnley. This was sufficiently pointed to show in what direction her affections leaned, and I took advantage of the opportunity. Feigning an excuse, I ostensibly went to London, but in reality remained at Horiston, where I obtained from the costumer a similar dress to that worn by Jerringham. Thus masked and disguised I repaired to the ball. There I was recognized by a Miss Belinda Pike, but she kindly consented to keep my secret. You can guess what happened. Deceived by the dress, my wife took me for Jerringham, and I learned sufficient to know that she loved him and hated me. I did not reveal myself, but went away mad with wrath. My sole idea was to unmask Jerringham and to show my wife how unworthy he was of her love. To this end I sought out Hilliston, and learning that my wife was shortly returning home, Hilliston and I went to the Laurels together, as I intended to make Mona confess that Jerringham was her lover. I left Hilliston outside in the garden to watch for the coming of my wife and enter the house to see Mona. She was waiting in the sitting-room for her mistress, and I then and there forced her to admit the truth. She declared that Jerringham was the father of her unborn child, and implored me not to tell her brother. Fortunately, I had directed Dennis to stay in the entrance hall, so he did not hear his sister's confession, and she was safe for the time being. While I was talking to Mona, my wife entered. She immediately accused me of having feigned a visit to London in order to stay at home with Mona. The girl slipped out of the room, and my wife continued her ravings. She said that Jerringham had come home with her, and was at that moment in the garden. There she swore to join him. I prevented her leaving the room, and ultimately she fainted. I ran out to call Mona, and found that she had left the house, no doubt to join Jerringham in the garden, to tell him that the secret was known. I also went into the garden to seek for Jerringham. To my horror, I stumbled over a dead body, and hastily ran back for a light to see whose it was. Dennis came with the lantern, and we found it was the corpse of Jerringham. He had been stabbed to the heart. I would have given the alarm, but that Dennis, quicker-witted than I at the moment, prevented me. He pointed out that it was well known that I was on bad terms with Jerringham, that the unhappy man had been murdered in my garden, that my hands were red with the blood, and my clothes stained owing to handling the corpse, and said that I would be accused of the murder. I saw in a flash the peril in which I stood. I don't know if Dennis suspected me of the crime, as he was not present when I first found the body, but he acted the part of a friend. We threw the body into the river, and I made my preparations for flight. No one but Hilliston and Miss Pike knew that I had returned from London on that night, for my wife would keep silence, as I thought, for her own sake, and Mona had disappeared. I left the house in charge of Dennis, and without a word to my wife, who had brought about this catastrophe, I sought safety in flight. It was cowardly, if you like, but I had no other resource. I would have been accused of the murder had I stayed, for the evidence was strong against me. I fled and trusted to chance to hide the crime. The rest you know. My wife was accused and tried for my murder, as Jerringham's corpse was so disfigured that it was thought to be mine. I have mentioned the strong resemblance between us, and this helped the deception. I was compelled to keep in hiding as Jerringham, but I declare, had the case gone against my wife, I should have come forward and told all. As it was, I went abroad, aided by Hilliston, who acted as my friend all through. He looked after my unhappy wife till she died in London. He took charge of you and brought you up like a son. He also secured me sufficient of my own property to live quietly, so I came to Thorston under the name of Paynton, and here I have lived ever since. I thought to die in peace, but you, Claude, have reopened the case. I tell you this to show you the futility of trying to find the real murderer. I do not know who killed Jerringham, nor do I think you will ever find out. If after reading this you still consider me your father, come at once to a most unhappy man. Be just, be lenient, my son, and forgive your unhappy father. Georges Larcher. 38. A new aspect of things. Tait folded over the last sheet of this long letter with a sigh. Although he was pleased for Claude's sake that Georges Larcher was still in the land of the living, yet he was distinctly disappointed that no communication had been made likely to elucidate the mystery. Yet the result of this confession was an entire displacement of the point whence it was necessary to survey the case. The motives which had caused the supposed death of Larcher would not suffice to explain the death of Jerningham. The case had assumed a new aspect, but nevertheless it was as complex and inexplicable as ever. Tait thought of all this with inconceivable rapidity, but did not give utterance to his opinion in the presence of his friend. "The letter is wonderful so far," was his sole remark, "but it is a great pity that it ends so abruptly. I suppose your father will personally relate all other details, Claude, when you see him again?" The young man assumed a sitting position and deliberately finished his wine before replying to this remark. He looked anxious and disturbed, and now that he had recovered from the overwhelming surprise at finding his father alive, seemed less delighted than he should have been. A miracle had been wrought on his behalf; the dead had been restored to life, but he was by no means gratified by the occurrence. "I don't know whether I shall see my father again," he said shortly. "But, my dear friend—" "Oh, I know all you would say," interrupted Claude hastily with a frown, "but I am not prepared to admit your arguments. My mother is alive, my father is in existence, yet for 25 years I have looked on them as dead. Can you then wonder that I feel awkward toward them both? That I am by no means disposed to render them that filial affection which, you must admit, they but ill deserve? The question is so delicate that I can only hold my peace," said Tait after a pause. "I admit what you say. Still they are your own flesh and blood." "I might answer you as Hamlet did on a like occasion," replied Claude with a bitter smile. "But a quotation will not mend matters. What I have to consider is the advisability of seeing my father again." "You must certainly see him again," said the other promptly. "Why?" "In the first place, he is your father, whatever you may say, and in the second you had better tell him personally that you abandon further investigation of the case. After all, your object is gone; for though you might want to avenge the death of a parent, the murder of a scamp like Jerningham can matter nothing to you." "Oh, that I abandon the case goes without speaking," said Claude quickly. "And you?" "I act in the same way. The further we go into the case the more perplexing does it become. It is beyond me. Only at the last day will the mystery be solved. Still," added Tait meditatively, "I must admit a curiosity yet exists on my part to know who struck the blow. Of course your father's story corroborates Dicky Pentel's, but the gardener mistook him for Jerningham by reason of the fancy dress. Does this letter suggest anything to you? It narrows the field of inquiry, that is all. Your mother, your father, and Dennis Bantry must necessarily be innocent, as they were in the house when the murder took place in the garden. If they are innocent, who is guilty? We have a choice of two who were outside at the time. You can choose between Hilleston and Mona Bantry." "Mona Bantry kill her lover? How do you make that out?" "You forget your father's account of the scene in the sitting room," said Tait significantly. "Then Mrs. Larcher asserted in the presence of Mona that she had come with Jerningham, furthermore that he was in the garden. Mona, also jealous, acts as any other woman would have done in such a position. She goes into the garden to demand an explanation. There is a quarrel between her and Jerningham, and she kills him, then flies, not to hide her disgrace, but to evade the consequences of her act. That is a feasible theory, I think." Claude shook his head. "I don't agree with you," he said emphatically. "You forget that we have my mother's account of the matter to place against that of my father's. If you recollect, she also admitted finding my father and Mona in the sitting room. She also admits fainting, but there all resemblance between the accounts ceases. My mother distinctly says that she threatened her husband with the dagger, that it fell on the floor when she lost her senses. When she recovered them the dagger was gone. Now," continued Claude slowly, "if you remember, the crime was committed by means of the dagger, for it was found red with blood in the grounds, and then was taken possession of by the police. If my mother's account is the true one, Mona Bantry may certainly have picked up the dagger and have murdered Jerningham, as you suggest. But if my father's story is to be believed, Mona left the room before my mother fainted, and consequently could not have gained possession of the dagger. it follows as a natural consequence that she could not have committed the murder." Tait nodded several times during this explanation to show that he agreed with the points raised; but when Claude concluded he rubbed his chin in some perplexity. "Here we come to a dead stop," said he impatiently. "It was asserted by the police that the murder was committed with the dagger worn by your mother as part of the fancy dress." "Yes. If you remember, it was on that evidence she was arrested." "Well, if she wore that dagger in the sitting room, Jerningham could not have been killed with it, because the murder must have taken place while your father was trying to pacify your mother." Claude glanced at the letter again. "My father makes no mention of the dagger in this," he said, with a puzzled look. "No. I should like to hear what he has to say on the subject, the more so as I incline to his story rather than to your mother's." "For what reason?" "In her conversation with you, Mrs. Besell, or rather your mother, said that she had threatened your father with the dagger in the sitting room at the Laurels." "Yes. Well?" "If you remember, the evidence given by her to the police at the time of the arrest was that she had lost the dagger at the ball, and knew not into whose hands it had fallen." Claude looked nonplussed, and knew not what answer to make. That his mother had made two different statements he was compelled to admit. He further remembered that his father had made no statement whatsoever about the dagger. Yet on the possession of that dagger turned the whole of the case. Whoever picked it up, whether at the ball or in the sitting room, must have killed Jerningham. Assuming his father's account to be true, and Claude saw no reason to doubt its accuracy, Mona could not have committed the murder, nor could Mr. or Mrs. Larcher be guilty. It therefore followed that his mother had spoken truly to the police, and for some inexplicable reason falsely to him. The dagger must have been lost at the ball and picked up by whom? "I can make nothing of it," he said, after due consideration. "The only way to get at the truth is to tell my father that his wife still lives, and bring them together. Out of their meeting good may come." "You will then call and see your father," said Tait encouragingly. "Yes, I must. I see no way out of it. He must be informed that my mother lives, and I am the proper person to tell him so. Though it is strange," added Claude suddenly, "that Hillerston never told him." "Humph! That gentleman seems to serve both sides," said Tait gruffly. "Your mother speaks well of him, your father thinks no end of him, and both trust him, yet for what I can see, he has deceived both." "How?" "Why, by keeping back the truth from each. He has let your father think your mother dead, and vice versa. What do you make of that?" "I tell you I can make nothing of the whole confusion," said Claude crossly. "I will see my father and abandon the case, for I am sick of the affair. It is maddening. What a pity your lunatic did not wake up a few minutes earlier so as to see who struck the blow and thus have settled the matter. But it is not that which troubles me." "No? What else disturbs your mind?" "Jennie." "Jennie!" echoed Tait, with feigned simplicity. "I am afraid I am dull. I don't see." "You must be blind, then," retorted Claude in an exasperated tone. "You know I love Jennie." "Well?" "I can't love her. She is my half sister." "Indeed!" said Tait, in no wise astonished at this announcement. "How do you make that out?" "Why, isn't Jennie the daughter of Painton, and isn't he my father?" "He is your father, certainly, but I assure you Jennie is not his daughter. She is no relation to him." "Tait, what do you mean?" "Can't you guess?" "No. Out with it, man. Don't keep me in suspense." "Why," drawled Tait, enjoying the situation, "Jennie is the niece of Dennis. In other words, she is the child of Mona Bantry and Jerningham." End of chapters 37 and 38. Chapters 39 and 40 of the third volume by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 39. The Garnet Scarf Pin. That same evening Claude called to see his father. He decided to go alone, but asked Tait to repair to Rose Cottage within the hour so that, the meeting with his newly found parent having taken place, a consultation could be held by the three regarding the proceeding with or withdrawing of the case. Tait especially stipulated that this arrangement should be come to, as he was desirous of seeing Mr. Larcher senior in order to disabuse his mind of the straightforwardness of Hilliston. Privately, Tait believed that the lawyer would yet be found guilty of the crime. On no other grounds could he explain the attitude taken up by Hilliston since the papers had been placed in Claude's hands. The evidence of Miss Pike and Dick Pendle failed to alter his idea on this point. Tait himself was beginning to feel weary of the investigation. At every turn it took he was baffled by some fresh obstacle, and he was not ill pleased to find that the matter was at an end so far as Claude was concerned. That young man had sworn to avenge the death of his father, but now that his father proved to be still in existence the oath was null and void. So that, Claude married to Jenny, he would be quite willing to leave the solution of the mystery surrounding the death of Jerringham to Tait. But Tait himself determined to have nothing further to do with so wearisome a problem. He waited considerably beyond the hour before leaving for the cottage, as he rightly considered the father and son would have much to say to one another. Moreover, it was necessary to give Larcher time to overcome his emotion on learning that his wife was still in existence. Tait was by no means sure that the old gentleman would be pleased with this revelation. According to his own showing, his relations with his wife had been none of the best, and to renew those relations after 25 years could hardly fail to be most unpleasant. During this time Tait gave no thought to Jenny or Dennis. As to the former, he was so satisfied that she was the daughter of Jerringham by Mona Bantry that he did not think it worth while to give the matter the benefit of the doubt. What he was curious to know was how Painton, or rather Captain Larcher, came to stand in the position of an adopted father. Information on this point was conveyed to him before he reached the cottage by Dennis himself. The old servant walked briskly along the road, looking quite rejuvenated. He had heard the good news, and it had transformed his life. In place of a crabbed expression, his face appeared wonderfully cheerful, and he saluted Tait with a grin of pleasure. The other could not forbear commenting on his changed appearance, so clearly apparent even in the waning light of evening. "Why, Carey, you look 10 years younger," he said, stopping short in his amazement, with an afterthought of Dick Pendle's accusation. "Ah, and I do that same, sir," said Dennis, saluting in military fashion. "And you know why, sir?" "Are they reconciled?" asked Tait, guessing what was in the mind of the old servant. "Begad, they are. Chattering together like two lovebirds, and my old master looking on with pride." "Why, Carey, I spoke of Captain Larcher." "Ah, did you now, sir?" "I spoke of Master Claude. God bless him and Miss Jenny. God bless her. God bless them both," cried Carey, taking off his hat with a burst of affection. "And his honour along with them. Oh, glory be to the saints for this blessed day! But sure I am forgetting my service, sir. The master is waiting to see you this very minute." "I was just on my way," said Tait, signing to Carey to go on. "We will walk there together. By the way, does Miss Jenny know she is not the daughter of your master?" "She knew it all along, sir." "Ah, and why should you look surprised at that, Mr. Tait? Is it because she is the niece of an old soldier like me?" "No, no, Carey. But as you are aware, Miss Jenny knows the case from those newspapers she found, and in that report Jerringham—" "I see what you mean, sir," said Carey, touching his hat in a deprecating manner. "But sure she doesn't know all. She believes herself to be the child of my sister Mona, who is dead, rest her soul, and of a Mr. Kennedy. We've invented a father for her, sir. 'Twould never do for her to know she was the daughter of the poor man who was killed." "It's just as well, Carey. Do you know who killed him?" Tait asked this question with a keen glance at the man. "No, sir. How should I know? I ran out with the light when the captain called, but I don't know who struck him the cruel blow. He was a bad man, sir, deceiving my sister and disgracing the Bantry family, but he is dead, and she is dead, so we'll let them rest, and the heavens be their bed." By this time they were at the garden door, and striking his hand over these sad memories, Carey led the visitor into the house, and showed him into the book room. Here were assembled Claude, his father, and Jenny, all looking supremely happy, though the old gentleman appeared to be rather shaken. He rose when Tait entered and held out his hand. "I am glad to see you, Mr. Tait," said he in an unsteady voice, "and I thank you for the way in which you have aided my son. I feel that an apology is due to you for my behavior on your last visit." "Don't mention it," replied Tait cordially, shaking the extended hand. "Under the circumstances you could not act otherwise. Well, Miss Painton, am I to—" "Don't call me Miss Painton now, Mr. Tait," she said, smiling. "There can be no need for further concealment. I can take my own name, that of—" "Miss Kennedy," said Tait quickly. "Do not look so surprised. Carry told me all about it as I came along. I am at once astonished and delighted." "I don't wonder at it," said Captain Larcher, patting Claude's hand. "You see, I have found a son." "And soon, sir, you will lose a daughter," observed Tait significantly. "Oh, no," observed Claude with a laugh. "When I marry Jenny we will all live together as a happy family." "Marriage! Has it come to that?" "You are astonished, I see, Mr. Tait," said the old gentleman, shaking his head. "I am myself. It is too soon, too sudden. They have only known each other a few weeks, and it is impossible that a union on so short an acquaintance can prove happy." "We will have a long engagement," said Claude, "in order to prove if we truly love one another. But I am not afraid of the result." "Neither am I," remarked Jenny, slipping her arm within that of her lover. "I am sure nothing will come between us. But come, Claude, and we will see my uncle, for I notice that Mr. Tait is anxious to speak to your father about that horrid case." Captain Larcher nodded his approval of this, so Claude and Jenny left the room to seek Carry, and be wept over by the old servant. Left alone with his host, Tait took a chair by the table, and they looked at one another in silence. The Captain was the first to break it. "There is no need for me to recapitulate the events of the day," he said with a weary sigh. "As Claude told me, you read my letter, and are in possession of all the facts. You may believe, Mr. Tait, that I feel considerably shaken. My interview with Claude has been rather trying. He has behaved in the most affectionate manner." "Well, now your troubles are all at an end, Captain Larcher, and—" "At an end, sir?" he interrupted sharply. "No, they will continue. My innocence is not yet proved, and I must still remain here under a feigned name unless you agree to help me." "Certainly I agree. Is it your intention and Claude's to go on with the case?" "We have come to that decision, but I wanted to consult you before finally making up my mind. Do you think we ought to proceed?" "I certainly do," said Tait promptly. "It is true that the police think that you are the victim; but if you want to assume your own name, inquiries would certainly be made. One is never safe in these criminal matters, even after the lapse of years. If you did declare yourself to be Captain Larcher, then it would come out that Jerningham is dead, and you would have to clear yourself. Besides, the evidence of Dicky Pentle would implicate you, seeing that he mistook you in that fancy dress for Jerningham." "True enough," replied Larcher, nodding. "And there is another reason. I have just learned that my wife is still alive, and is protected by Hillerston at Hampstead. I sent Claude out of the room so that I could ask you a plain question. Give me a plain answer, and tell me what are the relations between them." "I don't care to answer that plainly," said Tait with some hesitation. "But I think you can guess." "Does Hillerston love my wife?" "On the authority of Miss Belinda Pike, whom I saw at Horiston, I believe he does." "And for her sake he had deceived me all these years?" "It seems so. In fact, Captain Larcher, Hillerston has been playing a double game. He kept you and your wife apart by assuring each that the other was dead. That conduct alone stamps him as a villain. Then again, he threw all kinds of obstacles in the way while we were investigating this case." "What for?" "My own opinion is that Hillerston committed the murder." Captain Larcher clenched his hand and thought for a few moments. "It might be so," he muttered, more to himself than to Tait. Hilliston was in the garden. If he loved my wife, a fact which I never suspected, he might have killed Jerningham out of jealousy. But the dagger, how did he obtain that? No doubt at the ball. I assure you, Mr. Tait, that my wife had not the dagger when in the sitting-room. She declares that she threatened you with it. Then she either forgets or speaks falsely. She wore it at the ball when I spoke to her there, but when she returned it was missing. Hilliston came with me, knowing Jerningham was with my wife. He might have picked up the dagger with the fullest intention of committing the crime. Now that I know he loved my wife, I am not prepared to say how he acted in the garden while I was in the house. And the garnet scarf-pin mentioned in the novel? That belonged to Hilliston, said Larcher quickly. I gave it to him myself. Dennis picked it up in the garden, but I thought nothing of that, as I was aware Hilliston was in the grounds on that night. But now I believe. Oh, I am afraid to say what I believe. I may be wrong. There is one way of finding out the truth, Captain Larcher. Come up to town this week and see your wife. Then we may learn all. The old gentleman leaned his head on his hand in deep thought for a few minutes. I will come, he said at length. At whatever cost, I will force the guilty woman to own the truth. 40. Face to Face. The conversation between Tait and Captain Larcher was not finished that evening, as the old gentleman, worn out by the excitement of the day, early retired to bed. However, he declared that he would be shortly ready to journey to London, and Claude left the cottage with Tait on the understanding that his father was to be called for next day. Before they parted for the night, Claude made a remark about Hilliston. "I hope he won't get wind of this," he said dubiously, "or he may get Mrs. Bessel, I can't call her mother, out of the way." "Have no fear," replied Tait calmly. "Hilliston's hands are too full at present." "What do you mean?" "Why," said Tait, lighting his candle, "your father showed me a letter from Hilliston, apologizing for not coming over, as his wife was lying dangerously ill at the Connaught Hotel at Eastbourne. He said something of that in his note to me. What is the matter with Mrs. Hilliston?" "She has the smallpox." "The smallpox!" echoed Claude in a tone of horror. "Poor creature! She is a dead woman." "I don't know so much about that. She may recover." "She may recover from the disease," said the young man gloomily, "but not from the blow to her vanity. Many a time has she told me that if she lost her looks she would kill herself. You mark my words, Tait, within the week we will hear of her death." And with these prophetic words Claude retired to his room. Tait had no time to think of this conversation, being occupied with anticipation regarding the meeting of Captain Larcher and his wife, but it so happened that Claude's prognostications occurred to him when the truth of the Horiston tragedy was discovered, and that was not long afterward. Perhaps, like the young men, Fate herself grew weary of an affair which had dragged on for 25 years. At all events, she brought matters to a conclusion with almost inconceivable rapidity. The first step toward the end was the meeting of husband and wife, which took place at Clarence Cottage, Hampstead, during the afternoon of the next day. In company with his son and Tait, the old gentleman drove to the railway station some 3 miles distant, and took the up express. When established comfortably in a first-class smoking carriage, for Captain Larcher was fond of a pipe, he resumed the conversation with Tait which had been broken off on the previous night. This time the subject was Hilliston and his doings. "I have been thinking over your suspicions regarding Hilliston," he said, addressing himself more directly to Tait, "and I confess that it is difficult to reconcile some of his actions with your view that he is guilty. Claude, as you know, was ignorant of the Horiston tragedy until enlightened by Hilliston." "I know that, my dear sir," said Tait quietly. "Hilliston certainly placed the papers containing the account of the matter in Claude's hands, but he was forced to do so by the action of Mrs. Bessel. I beg pardon, Mrs. Larcher." "Continue to call her Mrs. Bessel, if you please. I prefer it so. How did she force Hilliston to confide in Claude?" Because she read the book A Whim of Fate, and seeing the tragedy therein described, she wrote asking Claude to see her with the intention of telling him all. As you may guess, her story differs materially from that of Hylliston's, so of two evils, choosing the least, he determined to forestall her and inform Claude of the matter." "And he did so by means of the press," Claude said eagerly. "In place of telling me the story himself, he allowed me to gather what information I could from the scanty report of the Canterbury Observer. My dear father, the genesis of the whole matter springs from the finding of those papers by Jenny. Had she not read them and told Linton the story, he should not have written the book. Had he not done so, Mrs. Bessel would not have determined to tell me her version, and but for her threat to do so Hylliston would not have produced the papers." "Humph! The action was compulsory on the part of Hylliston?" "I think so, sir," said Tait complacently. "Therefore it is quite in keeping with his usual character. The rat did not fight till it was driven into a corner." "It is not in the corner," remarked Captain Larcher significantly, "but we'll drive it there and see if it will face our accusation. But what about Hylliston's introduction of Claude to me? Would it not have been to his interest to keep us apart?" "Oh," said Tait with some contempt for Hylliston's diplomacy, "that was another case of necessity. He knew that Claude and I were bent on discovering the truth, so, fearing that we should do so by further investigation, he thought to stop the whole matter by bringing you face to face with your son." "I don't see how that would accomplish his aim." "Hylliston hoped it would do so in two ways," explained Tait glibly. "First, he hoped that you would give your consent to Claude marrying Jenny, and so lead his mind away from the case, and second, he trusted that when Claude found you alive he would no longer desire to pursue the investigation." "He was right so far," said Claude seriously. "If that was Hylliston's calculation he made one great mistake," said Captain Larcher scornfully. "He did not think that I would wish to see my wife." "He must have been satisfied that Claude would tell you she was alive." "That of course. But he thought I would stay at Thorston as Ferdinand Peyton, and be afraid to admit my identity, even to my wife. I might have done so but for Claude. But I owe it to him to clear myself, and this meeting with my wife will be the first step toward doing so. Between us we must solve the mystery." "It is done, so far as I am concerned," said Tait grimly. "I am sure, as I am sitting here, that Hylliston murdered Jerningham. The gardener was just too late to see him do the deed." "But his motive?" asked Claude curiously. His father and Tait stole a glance at one another. They neither of them wished to make any remarks about Mrs. Larcher and Hylliston's passion, preferring that Claude should be ignorant of that episode. Still, when he asked so direct a question it was difficult to avoid a direct answer, but Larcher gave him one which was sufficiently evasive to stop further inquiries. "We must try and find out his motive," he said quietly. "Depend upon it, Claude, there is a good deal of underhand work in this of which we know nothing." "Do you think Mona committed the crime?" "No, I do not. In no way could she have gained possession of the dagger with which it was committed." "My mother says she had a dagger in the sitting room." "That is a mistake," said Captain Larcher, using as delicate a word as he could think of. "She threatened me with the sheath of the dagger, and no doubt, being agitated at the time, she thought it was the weapon itself. But I noticed when she entered the room that the sheath was empty. Her story to the police at the time of the trial is more likely. She lost it in the ballroom. The question is, who picked it up? Judging from the knowledge I now have of his character, I believe it was Hylliston who did so." "Or Jerningham," said Tait suddenly. "Impossible. How could Jerningham have found it?" "He was with Mrs. Larcher all the evening, and may have seen the dagger fall. Or, again, he may have taken it out of the sheath to examine it and have forgotten to return it. It is not improbable that in such a case he might have recollected it when he was in the garden, and offered it to Mona to return to her mistress." "Oh," said Claude with contempt, "and on that slight ground you suppose that Mona killed him?" "It is not beyond the bounds of probability." "Nonsense!" said Captain Larcher angrily. "I don't believe it. Mona was a good girl, foully deceived by Jerningham. She fled from the house to hide her disgrace, thinking my wife would tell her brother. Hylliston afterward met her in London, where she died in giving birth to Jenny." "Then it was Hylliston who brought Jenny to you?" "Yes. Because her uncle Dennis was in my service. I adopted Jenny, but told her that she was the child of a Mr. Kennedy and Mona Bantry. She believed her father and mother were married, so do not disturb that view of the case." "Certainly not," said Tait emphatically. "It would be cruel to do so. But here we are at Victoria. After seeing Mrs. Besell at Hampstead we can resume our conversation." "If we do, it will be from a different standpoint, I fancy," said Larcher significantly, as the train stopped. Tait's brougham was waiting for them at the station, and in this they drove up to Hampstead. Leaving it in Fitzjohn's Avenue, they walked down Hunt Lane to Clarence Cottage. Mrs. Besell occupied her usual seat in the window, and caught sight of Claude as he preceded his father and Tait up the path. A terrified expression crossed her face, but she made no motion to forbid their entrance. Yet a sense of coming evil struck at her heart, and it needed all her self-control to prevent herself from fainting when they were shown into the room. "My dear mother," said Claude, kissing her, "you must be prepared for unexpected news. I beg of you to control yourself, for—" He stopped short in astonishment. Mrs. Besell was looking at Captain Larcher with a bewildered air, and he gazed at her face with an expression of amazement. She shrank back as he crossed the room with rapidity and bent over her. "Mona Bantry!" he cried. "Is it possible that you still live?" End of chapters 39 and 40. Chapters 41 and 42 of the third volume by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 41. An explanation. On hearing his father's exclamation, Claude turned round with a look of supreme astonishment. He could not understand the meaning of that sudden exclamation. "Father, you do not understand. This is your wife, my mother." "Is it indeed?" sneered Captain Larcher, who had recovered from his momentary emotion. "Nothing of the sort, sir. This woman is Mona Bantry, who was my wife's maid." "Are you sure?" cried Tait, who was beginning to be bewildered by these successive revelations. "Sure, sir, as sure as I am of my own innocence. As sure as I am George Larcher, this is the sister of Dennis Bantry who—" "Dennis?" The interruption came from Mrs. Besell. She had sat dumbfounded at the unexpected appearance of the man whom she had thought dead, and she had said nothing while assertion and denial were going on, but the mention of her brother's name stirred her dormant faculties, and she sat up looking wildly around. "Dennis!" she cried in a terrified tone. "Is Dennis here?" "Dennis is down at Thorston," said Captain Larcher gruffly, "as you no doubt knew well enough." "I swear I did not. Francis told me Dennis was in America." "Francis!" exclaimed Claude, forgetting to whom the name belonged. "Francis Hylliston." "Ah!" said Captain Larcher with a disdainful look round. "I might have guessed as much. Off with the dead, love, on with the living. You have amended the proverb." "I did not know Mark was dead, sir," exclaimed Mrs. Besell passionately. "Francis said that he had gone to America with Dennis. I thought he had done so to escape the consequences of his crime, but—" "Of his crime?" cried Claude. "He was the victim, poor soul, not the murderer. It was Jerningham who was killed, not my father." "Your father?" said Mrs. Besell, looking steadily at Captain Larcher. "Yes, it is my old master. So you are alive, and he is dead. Why did you kill him, sir?" "I did not kill him," replied the captain quietly. "And as a counter question, may I ask why you passed yourself off to Claude as my wife?" Mrs. Besell burst into a wild laugh and clapped her hands together. Then she covered her face and commenced to weep, but in a few moments the fit of hysteria passed away and she became cool and composed. Thrown off her balance for the time being, she had now gathered her wits together and was ready to fight. Her folly and impulse had brought about this catastrophe, and it was her duty to set it right again, if she could. But the upshot of the matter was extremely doubtful. On his part, Captain Larcher was relieved to find that Mrs. Bessel proved to be Mona Bantry instead of his wife. Ever since the communication made by Claude he had suffered agonies at the thought that his wife had been living all these years under the protection of his false friend. Now that fear was set at rest once and forever. Julia Larcher had really died, as Hylliston had asserted, and the woman in Clarence Cottage who had taken her name was the maid in place of the mistress. Out of all the trouble Larcher extracted this morsel of comfort. His honor was unstained. Meanwhile the three visitors sat waiting to hear what Mrs. Bessel had to say. She saw that they expected a confession, and resolved to disappoint them. Leaning backward among her cushions, she closed her eyes and played a waiting game. It proved successful, for in 2 minutes or thereabouts Captain Larcher broke out. His temper was none of the best, and recent events had not tended to improve it. "Well, madam," he said sharply, rapping his stick on the ground. "I am waiting to hear what you have to say." "I have nothing to say," said Mrs. Bessel quietly. "Oh yes, you have," began Tait, "as you set the ball—" But at this moment he was interrupted by Larcher. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Tait, but I will question this woman myself. Pray do not speak, nor you, Claude, till I have done." Both young men bowed their heads and acquiesced in silence. After all, the captain was the proper person to examine Mona Bantry. He knew more of the case than anyone else, and conversant as he was with the events of that fatal night, he would know whether she spoke truly or falsely. Mrs. Bessel looked uneasy on hearing his resolution, but only compressed her lips tighter as though resolved to let nothing escape her. But he was a match for her in obstinacy. "Now then," said Larcher, turning to her, "relate your history from the moment you left me alone with my wife 25 years ago at the Laurels." "It would not help you if I did." "I'm not so sure of that. But I understand. You are afraid of incriminating yourself." "I!" exclaimed Mrs. Bessel indignantly. "What have I to do with the matter? I know nothing of it. I left the house then and there, and only heard of the tragedy while I was concealed at Horiston, more than a week afterward." "Why did you state to my son that Mrs. Larcher threatened me with the dagger?" "So she did," said Mrs. Bessel coolly. "I saw her hand raised. I saw the dagger in it." "You saw the sheath of the dagger, you mean," retorted Larcher. "It fell on the floor and was found there next day. But the weapon with which the crime was committed was lost by my wife at the ball." "It may have been," said the woman indifferently. "I don't know anything about it." "Did not Jerningham show it to you when you joined him in the garden?" "I tell you I did not see him on that night. When you found out my secret, I was afraid that you and the mistress would betray it to my brother Dennis, so I left the room and fled. I thought Jerningham would join me at Horiston next day, but then I heard of your supposed death, and that he had fled. Until this hour I did not know that it was the other way round." "Did not Hylliston tell you? He knew." "No, Captain Larcher, he did not," said Mrs. Bessel emphatically. "He said that Jerningham had gone to America with my brother." "Where did you go after leaving Horiston?" "I came to London, and remained there till my baby was born." "And then?" "I found that my money had come to an end, and called at Mr. Hylliston's office to ask him to help me." "What right had you to expect help from him?" "I had no right, but that I knew he would assist me because of his love." "His love!" exclaimed Larcher sharply. "Did Hylliston love you?" "Yes. I refused to have anything to do with him on account of Jerningham. But he did love me. Oh yes, I know you thought he was in love with your wife, but such was not the case. He loved me, and me only." Larcher drew a long breath and looked puzzled. He was relieved to find that he had not been mistaken in Hylliston after all, yet the assertion of Mrs. Bessel only seemed to further complicate the case. If Hylliston did not love Mrs. Larcher, what possible motive could he have to kill Jerningham? The looks of Claude and Tait reflected his perplexity. But dismissing this special point for the moment, he pursued his examination. "How did Hilleston receive you?" Mrs. Besell looked around with a bitter smile. Her meaning was clear from the contemptuous expression on her face. "Can you not guess from what you see here?" she said quietly. "Francis Hilleston bought me. He loved me well enough, but not sufficiently to marry me. He did not ruin me, for I was already ruined. I accepted his offer to come here and be his mistress. What else could I do? I was alone in London. I was friendless. I believed that my lover and my brother had fled to America. I could not return to Horiston lest I might be involved in the tragedy at the Laurels. I did what any other woman would have done, and made the best of a bad business. I accepted the love and protection of Francis Hilleston. The protection still continues, as you see. The love, that is dead and done with." "I see you are thinking of Louisa Sinclair," interposed Tait quietly. "What do you know of Louisa Sinclair?" asked Mrs. Besell with a violent start. "Everything, thanks to you," answered Tait. "Your letter put the clue into my head. I went to Horiston. I saw a portrait of Miss Sinclair. I know that she went to America after the tragedy, and returned as Mrs. Derrick, rich and beautiful, to marry Hilleston." "Ah, you know that much?" "Yes. Louisa Sinclair is my rival. 10 years ago she came back to England and wanted Francis to marry her. I fell ill. I became paralyzed. He forgot me. He forgot my love, and she became his wife. Oh, how I hate her! I hate him! It was on that account that I wrote to you, Claude, to reveal all." "You then acted out of revenge." "Yes, I did," said Mrs. Besell sullenly. "Look at me. A wreck. Look at her, his wife, rich and handsome and healthy." "Not healthy, poor soul," said Claude. "She is ill with the smallpox." "With the smallpox!" echoed Mrs. Besell joyfully. "I'm glad of it. I'm glad of it. Her beauty will depart, as mine has done. Then Francis may come back to me." "You love him still?" asked Captain Larcher in wonderment. "Too well to ruin him. You want me to accuse him of the crime, but I tell you he is innocent. He knows nothing." "He was in the garden alone on that night. None other but he." "He was not alone," cried Mrs. Besell sharply. "Louisa Sinclair was with him. Yes, she followed him from the ball because she was jealous of me. In my flight I passed her at the gate. She had a cloak over her dress, but I saw that it was the costume of Mary, Queen of Scots." "And you knew her by that?" "Partly. My mistress told me that Miss Sinclair had a similar costume to her own, for she was very angry about it. But I saw her face as I fled. She may know who killed Jerningham. I do not. Hilleston does not. Now I have told you all. Go away and leave me. I speak no more." "First tell us why you declared yourself to be my mother," said Claude sharply. "For safety. I regretted that I had told you, that I had forced Hilleston into defending himself. I was afraid lest you should learn too much and denounce me as the criminal. So long as you thought I was your mother you would not dare to do so, and therefore I told you I was Mrs. Larcher." "One last word," said Captain Larcher, rising to his feet. "Your child. What became of it?" "Hilleston took it away," said Mrs. Besell in a melancholy tone. "I was ill at the time, and he overcame my scruples. I don't know where my child is. Often and often have I wanted to see her again, but Francis has always refused. Oh, where can she be?" "I can tell you." "You?" cried Mrs. Besell, starting up in amazement. "Yes. Your daughter, Jenny, was brought by Hilleston to me. I adopted her as my child, and she is now at Thorston with her uncle Dennis, your brother." Mrs. Besell tried to speak, but could not. With a wild glance around, she heaved a long sigh, and fainted. The joy of hearing that her child was alive proved too much for her enfeebled frame. 42. The tragedy of a woman's vanity. Meantime, Hilleston, unaware of that fatal meeting with Mona Bantry, which threatened to demoralize his plans, was devoting himself to his unfortunate wife. She was very ill and not expected to recover, so feeling that he would soon lose her, the lawyer stayed constantly by her side and strove, though unsuccessfully, to ameliorate her cruel sufferings. It was all the more credit to him that he did so, as he had married her mainly for her money and was still in love with Mrs. Bessel. No doubt remorse had something to do with his present attitude. The landlord of the Connaught Hotel had insisted upon Mrs. Hilliston being removed when the first symptoms of disease showed themselves. He declared that were it known that he had a smallpox patient in his house he would be ruined for the season, so Hilliston, recognizing the truth of this assertion, took steps to isolate his wife, as was necessary from the nature of her illness. Assisted by the doctor, who attended to all details relative to the municipal authorities, he hired a small house on the outskirts of Eastbourne, and thither the wreck of what had once been a beautiful woman was removed one evening. Nurses were hired from London, Hilliston sent word to his partner that he would not return to business for some weeks, and then began the slow martyrdom of the sick room. It was a fortnight since Mrs. Hilliston had been seized with the disease, and now it had taken so favourable a turn that the doctor held out great hopes that she would recover. But the beauty of which she had been so proud was gone, and with it went the hopes that she could still retain her husband by her side. Mrs. Hilliston knew well enough that it was only her persistence which had made Hilliston marry her, and now that she had lost her good looks, the one hold she had on his lukewarm affection, she foresaw only too clearly that he would neglect her in the future. Moreover, the woman's vanity was so powerful that she could not accept calmly the possibility of surviving, a scarred and maimed object, to face looks of pity and of horror. She felt that she would rather die, and in fact resolved to do so. Meanwhile she tossed and turned and moaned and wept on her sick bed, crying out against the stern fate which had dealt her such hard measure. Yet in her secret soul she admitted that the punishment was just. Hilliston was scarcely less unhappy than his wife. While her illness was serious, he had thought of nothing but how to save her, but now that a chance of recovery offered a respite from his arduous attendance by the sick bed, he had time to turn his thoughts toward the Horston tragedy. He wondered that he had not heard from Peyton relative to the interview with Claude, and fearful lest some untoward event had occurred to upset his plans, he wrote to Rose Cottage asking for information. To-day he had received a reply, and on reading it saw his worst fears realized. "I know you now," wrote Captain Larcher briefly. "I have seen Claude. I have seen Mona. Henceforth I look upon you as an enemy, and I intend to take immediate steps to clear my name at your expense." There was no signature, but Hilliston was too well acquainted with his friend's writing to have any doubt as to the genuineness of the letter. The blow had fallen. Mona had betrayed him, and he sat there helpless, with the letter in his hand, a spectacle of baffled scheming, of unmasked villainy. "To clear his name at my expense," muttered Hilliston to himself. "What does he mean by that? He cannot have discovered but no, that is impossible. When they find out who picked up that dagger at the ball they may learn the truth, but not till then. I defy them all. Larcher will remain Peyton till the end of his life. Mona! Ah, I shall punish her when I return to town for her cruel treachery." While he was thus thinking, a nurse entered the room to intimate that Mrs. Hilliston would like to see him. The lawyer obeyed the summons at once, placed Larcher's letter in his pocket, smoothed his brow, and entered the sick room. Signing to the nurse to go away, Mrs. Hilliston waited till she was alone with her husband. "Francis," she said in a low voice, stretching out her hand, "I wish to speak to you on that subject." "I think it would be wise if you refrained from doing so," replied Hilliston, knowing to what she alluded. "We understand one another on that point. You can do no good by bringing it up again. Why should you?" "For Claude's sake," said Mrs. Hilliston feverishly. "You owe him some reparation." "I owe him none, Louisa. I have acted like a father to him, and he has turned on me. I helped Larcher to hide himself when it was dangerous for him to become known, and he tells me that I am his enemy." "Have you heard from him?" "I received a curt note of 3 lines intimating that he was about to assert his innocence and clear his name at my expense." "Francis," cried Mrs. Hilliston in a tone of terror, "you are lost. If all is known—" "All will not be known. replied Hilliston, patting her hand. "Only two people know the truth. You and I. We can keep our own counsel." "But that little man, Tait, is at Horiston." "What of that?" "He will see Belinda Pike there. You know how she hated me because I loved you. She wanted to marry you herself. If he meets Miss Pike she will speak against me." "What of that?" said Hilliston soothingly. "You forget, my dear, that your life is different now. No one can find Louisa Sinclair in Louisa Hilliston. When you went to America you vanished and returned as Mrs. Derrick, the rich widow. Belinda Pike can never learn that. My dear, you distress yourself suddenly. We are perfectly safe." "But the garnet scarf pin?" questioned Mrs. Hilliston feverishly. "I am secure on that point. Larcher knew that I was in the garden on that night, and may have thought I dropped it. He will not dare to accuse me of the crime. If he did," continued Hilliston, his brow growing black, "I could turn the tables on him in a manner he little expects. There is more evidence against him than against me." "But if they learn that I was with you on that night?" "They will never learn. No one saw you there. If they did, what does it matter? Louisa Sinclair is dead. You need have no fear of being recognized. I'll answer for that." "It does not matter to me if I'm known or not," said Mrs. Hilliston gloomily. "I have done with life." "My dear, the doctor says you will recover." "I shall not recover," said the sick woman with emphasis. "Oh, do not deceive yourself, Frances. I shall never rise from this sick bed to be an object of horror and pity to you." "My dear!" "You never loved me. You only married me out of pity. At Horiston you refused to make me your wife, and it was only when I returned from America a rich woman that you did so. Pity," she said with a scornful laugh. "No, not pity, but necessity. You would have been ruined but for my money. I admit it, Louisa, and I am deeply grateful to you for the way in which you have helped me. I can never repay you for saving my name and credit." "You can, Frances. Get me my dressing case." "Louisa, you cannot. I insist upon being obeyed," she said imperiously. "Get me my dressing case." With great reluctance he brought it from a distant table and placed it on a chair by the bedside. In obedience to her directions he opened it and took therefrom a sealed envelope. "In there," she said as he held it in his hand, "is an account of all I saw on that fatal night. You must send that letter to Captain Larcher when I am dead." "Louisa, do you wish to ruin me?" "I wish to save you, Frances. Do not deceive yourself into a belief that the investigation is at an end. Claude may cease to meddle with the matter, for he is in love with Jenny, and will probably marry her, for by this time, according to you, he knows who she is. But I am afraid of Spencer Tait. He will hunt you down. He will urge Larcher to find out the truth. If it comes to that, send them my account of the matter." "It will ruin me," he said again. "It will save you," she repeated. "Do not be foolish, Frances. You can read it before sending it away." "But you—" "I shall be dead. I feel sure I shall not live. Promise me that if the worst comes you will send that letter." "I promise," he said sorely against his will. "But it will not be sent. You will live." "I don't think so, Frances. I know better than the doctor. Now kiss me, my husband, and leave me to myself." He did so in silence and took up the dressing case, whereupon she stopped him. "Let it be," she said quietly. "Some of your letters are in it, and I wish to read them. Kiss me again." Again he kissed her, and reluctantly left the room. So quiet and self-contained was she that he had no inkling of her intention. Had he guessed her fatal resolve, little as was the love he bore her, he would surely have striven to turn her from her purpose. But he guessed nothing, and left her alone with the devil tempting her. "Good-bye, my husband," she murmured as the door closed, and then burst into tears. He had gone. She would never see him again, and she moaned over her lost beauty which failed to retain him by her side. He was coldly polite. He was affectionate out of pity, but he had no love for her, and she hungered for the want of it. Her life passed before her, episode after episode, till it stopped short at the spectacle of a closed door, and herself lying alone and deserted in that sick room. She wept and prayed, and then, with a firm hand, took out of her dressing-case a small vial filled with a dark brown liquid. Twice she put it to her lips, and twice she hesitated. The third time she accomplished her purpose. The thought of her lost beauty, of her husband's neglect, of her childless home and wretched future, all these nerved her, and she drank off the contents, then quickly replaced the bottle in the dressing-case. When the nurse came in to see her patient, Mrs. Hilliston was lying back with a quiet smile on her pale lips. She had found peace at last. End of chapters 41 and 42. Chapters 43 through 45 of the third volume by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 43. The last appearance of Francis Hilliston. Unaware of the tragedy which had taken place at Eastbourne, Captain Larcher was in London brooding over his wrongs, and weaving schemes how to avenge himself on Hilliston. His eyes had been opened by Tait with regard to the conduct of that gentleman, and he now saw plainly that he had been Hilliston's dupe for all these years. Indeed, he began to share Tait's opinion that the lawyer was guilty, and was casting about in his own mind how to prove this, when an announcement in the papers informed him of the death of Mrs. Hilliston. "The smallpox killed her, no doubt," said Tait, when he had expressed his regrets. "No," remarked Claude, who had been looking over the general news. "It was a case of suicide." "Suicide!" exclaimed the hearers in one breath. "Yes, according to this paragraph. It appears that in some way or another she became possessed of a bottle of laudanum while the nurse was absent. The woman returned to find her patient dead." "Poor Mrs. Hilliston," added Claude, folding up the paper with a sigh. "How sorry I am to hear this." "I wonder why she committed suicide," said Tait meditatively. "She looked too determined a woman to yield to such a weakness." "No doubt she found out that her husband was guilty of the crime," said Larcher grimly, "and so did not care to live longer with a murderer." "You are wrong, father," observed Claude, looking up. "It was the knowledge that she had lost her looks which killed her. Depend upon it, she took the poison so as to avoid dragging out her days a scarred and miserable object." "How do you know that, Claude?" asked his father, with a curious look on his face. "Because not once but twice or thrice Mrs. Hilliston told me she would kill herself rather than grow old and ugly. The loss of beauty came with the smallpox, and so she has carried out her resolve. It will be a blow to Hilliston." "I don't think so," said Captain Larcher rather cynically. "From what I remember of Louisa Sinclair, the love was all on her side. No doubt he married her when she was Mrs. Derrick, purely for her money. No, no, I quite believe the story of Mona Bantry. She was and is the woman of his love. Now the wife is dead, he can console himself with the mistress." "That reminds me," observed Claude suddenly. "What are we to do about Jenny? Is she to be informed that her mother is yet alive?" Captain Larcher shook his head. "Set your mind at rest on that point," he said with a nod. "I told Mrs. Bezel that Jenny was about to become your wife, that she thinks her parents are dead, and I pointed out that it would be unwise to mar the happiness of the girl by letting her know the truth. Mrs. Bezel agrees with me, and she has consented that things shall remain as they are." "Does she not want to see Jenny, father?" "Of course she does. It is only natural, poor soul, but she loves her child sufficiently to avoid casting a shadow on her life. Jenny will never know that Jerningham was her father or that her mother is still alive. She will marry you, Claude, as Miss Kennedy, and know no more of her connection with the matter than she does at present." "And Dennis?" "Dennis has been told. I wrote him 2 days ago, and I have no doubt he will come up to town to see the last of his wretched sister." "The last of her?" "Can you doubt it? Mrs. Bezel has death written on her face." "Another blow for Hilliston," said Tait in a rather regretful tone. Villain as he knew the lawyer to be, he could not help feeling sorry for his troubles. Fate had held her hand a long time, but now she was dealing a full measure and pouring the vials of her wrath on the head of the sinner. "It will be a heavier blow than the last," said Larcher in a severe tone, "for there is no doubt Hylliston truly loves Mona. I suppose Dennis will object to his going near her again. It is impossible to say. We must leave that to the man himself." This conversation took place in Tait's rooms one morning some 3 weeks after the momentous interview with Mrs. Besell. It had been Captain Larcher's intention to return at once to Thorston, but he had been dissuaded from this by his son, who thought a few weeks in town would do his father good. There was no doubt on this point, for Captain Larcher brisked up wonderfully in the exhilarating atmosphere of the West End. But for the unexplained mystery of Jerringham's death he would have been quite happy in the recovered society of his son, and even while the future was still black enjoyed himself in no small degree. It did Claude good to see that his father was at length getting some pleasure out of life after his years of incessant trouble and wearing anxiety. The next day Dennis, looking older and greyer than ever, came up to see his sister. He saw his master for a few minutes, and then went on to Hampstead. "I have told Dennis how ill she is," explained Captain Larcher as the man took his departure, "and he has promised to be as lenient as possible toward her wrongdoing. By the way, Hylliston is in town." "Hylliston?" "Yes. He came up in the same train as Dennis, and had the impudence to speak to him. Asked him where I was, as he wanted to see me." "To see you, father?" cried Claude in astonishment. "What for?" "I think I can guess," interposed Tait quietly. "Hylliston has been stricken by his wife's death, and wants to atone for his sins by confessing the truth. I would not be surprised if he called here this afternoon." Captain Larcher looked sceptical, but said nothing, and the matter dropped for the time being. As it happened, Dennis was still ignorant that his sister had been the mistress of the lawyer, else there might have been trouble. He had but a confused idea of Hylliston's connection with the case, and beyond knowing that he was the owner of the garnet scarf pin, could not conceive that he had been actually present in the garden when the murder was committed. True it was that the scarf pin had been found on the spot where the corpse of Jerringham had lain, but assured by his master that Hylliston was innocent, as Captain Larcher had truly believed these many years, Dennis never gave the matter a second thought. Now he would learn the truth from Mrs. Besell. Dennis only came back in the afternoon, looking much put out. The ruin of his much-loved sister by Jerringham had been a great blow to him, but the discovery that she was alive and had been living in sin with Hylliston startled him considerably. He could hardly reply to the questions of his master, but ultimately related that they had parted friends. Mrs. Besell had told him that the doctor assured her she could not live much longer, and in the shadow of death Dennis had freely forgiven her all her sins and follies. "And indeed, sir, what else could I do?" said Dennis, wiping the tears from his eyes. "When I saw the poor thing lying there like a corpse. It's a bitter time she's had of it, these last 10 years, in that death-in-life state. Oh, yes, Captain, I forgave her freely, poor soul." "And Hylliston?" asked Larcher inquiringly. "May his black soul burn!" cried Dennis with a scowl. "Were I or he younger, I'd leave my mark on him. Mona had a letter from him saying he was calling to see her this evening, but that he had an appointment with you, sir." "With me, Dennis? It is the first I have heard of it. Where is he?" At this moment, as if in response to his question, the door opened and Tait appeared, looking very disturbed. "Mr. Hylliston is here, Captain Larcher, and wishes to speak with you." Claude had entered the room by another door, and on hearing this stepped forward looking slightly pale. He slipped his arm within that of his father as though to protect the elder man. Then they all waited to hear what Captain Larcher had to say. The permission for the interview must come from the man who had been most deeply wronged. He thought for a moment or so with a frown on his face, then sank into a chair with a deep sigh. "Dennis, stand behind me," he said in a peremptory tone. "Claude, sit down yonder. Now, Mr. Tait, we are ready to see our friend." Tait anticipated this permission, and was already prepared for it. Without a word he threw open the door, and Hylliston, dressed in deep mourning, entered the room with a paper in his hand. He looked pale and worn, his fresh colour was gone, and as he spoke he kept his eyes persistently on the ground. It could be easily seen that the man had received a shock from which he would not easily recover. "I have called to see you and deliver this," he said in a low tone, placing the paper he carried on the table. "I do not ask for your forgiveness, Larcher, for I do not consider I have done anything to justify your anger against me. You could have saved me all these years of anguish by telling me the truth," said Larcher indignantly. "Perhaps, but it was not to my interest to tell you the truth." "I don't wonder at that," said Claude bitterly. "You were afraid of the law." "Perhaps," said Hylliston again. "On the other hand, I may not be so guilty as you think me. You will find the truth in that paper." He pointed toward the table, and the eyes of all immediately turned in that direction, while Hylliston moved toward the door. "Having fulfilled the promise I made to my dead wife, I now take my leave," he said quietly. "I will never see any of you again, and some day you may learn that you have misjudged me. Good bye." He opened the door, but before he could pass through, Dennis sprang forward. "My sister?" he said, with an indignant look in his eyes. "I am about to repair the wrong I did her," replied the lawyer gravely. "By to-morrow she will be my wife." 44. The Truth. Hylliston came and went in the space of a few minutes. None of those present made any attempt to stay his exit, but as the door closed after him they looked at one another in silence. Thinking of Hylliston's last speech, Dennis was the first to speak. "What does that mean, sir?" he asked his master, with an air of helpless bewilderment. "I think it can only mean one thing, Dennis," replied Larcher, rousing himself. "Mr. Hylliston has at length awakened to the fact of his dastardly treatment of your sister, and is about to make reparation for the past. He intends to marry her." "But his wife only died a few days ago, master." "I know that. But Mrs. Bezel will also die shortly, and if Hylliston desires to atone for the past he has no time to lose. He can marry her at once, but he will again be a widower within the month." Dennis lifted a pair of shaking hands and slowly left the room, followed by the sympathetic looks of the others. He did not even pause to learn the contents of the sealed envelope left by Mr. Hylliston. Great as was his curiosity to learn all that had taken place on that fatal night, his love and grief for his sister were greater still. Bowed and grey and older looking than ever, he departed. But in his heart there was one comfortable thought. Mona would die an honest woman, if Mr. Hylliston was to be believed. When the three found themselves alone, Captain Larcher picked up the sealed letter with some reluctance. "Strange," he said, balancing it in his hand. "For years I have been eager to know the truth. Now that I have only to open this envelope to learn it, I feel half afraid." "Nevertheless, it will be as well to lose no time in making ourselves acquainted with the contents," said Tait eagerly, for he was in a fever of impatience to know all. "It may be a confession by Hylliston." "I think not. It is directed to me, in the handwriting of Mrs. Hylliston." "To Ferdinand Peyton?" "No, to Captain Larcher." "Hum," said Tait with a start. "How did Mrs. Hylliston know you were Captain Larcher? Did she see you at Thorston?" "No, but her husband doubtless informed her of my real name. However, we will learn all from this," said Larcher, breaking the seal. "I believe this is a confession by Mrs. Hylliston." "But what can she have to confess?" cried Claude, as his father smoothed out a closely written letter. "She can know nothing of the tragedy." "You forget," said Tait, with a sudden recollection. "Louisa Sinclair. She was at Horiston, and according to Mona Bantry was in the Garden of the Laurels on that night. I would not be surprised if she saw the committal of the crime." "What? Do you think she is about to betray her husband?" "Oh," said Tait significantly, "we are by no means sure of Hylliston's guilt." Larcher found that the writing was too small for him to read comfortably, so handed the letter to Claude, with a request that he should read it out loud. Excusing himself on the plea of the illegibility of the writing, Claude passed it to Tait, who accepted the office with avidity. The letter was without date or direction, and began in an abrupt manner highly suggestive of the agitation under which it had been written. Tait mentally noted these points, and began: "This confession is to be read after my death by Captain George Larcher, and if he sees fit, he has my free permission to make it public. Still, I trust out of regret for the memory of an unhappy woman that he will not do so save in the arising of two contingencies. First, should he still be alive and accused of murdering Mr. Jerningham. Second, should my dear husband be accused of the crime. In the event of the occurrence of either of these contingencies, I authorize him to make these pages public. To explain myself, I must go back 26 years, when I was residing at Horiston. You, Captain Larcher, will remember me well as Louisa Sinclair, for at that time I saw a great deal of yourself and your wife. I saw too much of her, for my eyes were sharp, and, but for a natural reluctance to disturb your domestic peace, I could have enlightened you as to her conduct. She was never worthy of a good man like you. She was as bad as I afterward became, and that is saying a great deal, as you will see by reading on. I loved Francis Hillerston, your intimate friend. Belinda Pike loved him also, but there was no need for either of us to be jealous of the other, for Mr. Hillerston loved a third person, none other than your wife. No doubt you will be angry when you read this, but your anger cannot alter facts. Yes, your dearest friend loved your wife. Let him deny that if he can." At this point there was a marginal note by Hillerston. "I do deny it, and but that I am not in a position to do so I would not let George Larcher's eyes rest on this confession. My poor wife was insanely jealous of Mrs. Larcher, but I swear that she had no grounds to be so. I admired Mrs. Larcher as a friend, nothing more, and I loved Mona Bantry. She is the only woman who has ever attracted me, and notwithstanding my marriage, now dissolved by death, she attracts me still." This note was hastily scribbled in pencil, and after Tait had read it, without interruption from Captain Larcher, he continued the confession. "I admit that I was jealous of his attentions to your wife," continued Mrs. Hillerston, "for though I did all in my power, I could not win him to my side. Regarding the efforts of Belinda Pike, I say nothing. She tried to gain his love, and she failed. I was more successful in the end, but not till the lapse of many years. Here I may say that I have gypsy blood in my veins, which at times renders me insanely jealous, and in such a state I am capable of all things. A recollection of this may enlighten you as to my acting as I did in the Garden of the Laurels. I knew that your wife loved Jerningham, and could have told you of it. I am sorry I did not now, as she would have been disgraced, and then Francis might have turned to me for consolation. But I held my peace, and paid the cost of doing so. I am doing so now. You also. For if you had been forewarned you would never have had to conceal yourself under a feigned name on account of Jerringham's death. At the fancy dress ball held at the town hall matters came to a climax. My gypsy blood made me mad on that night, owing to the way in which I was neglected by Francis Hillerston. With some difficulty I learned that your wife was to be dressed as Mary, Queen of Scots, and with a view to making myself attractive in Hillerston's eyes, I chose the same dress. With the assistance of the dressmaker who worked for us both, I obtained a dress similar in all respects to that of Mrs. Larcher, hoping that by doing so he would speak to me under the impression that I was your wife. My stratagem was successful. I was masked and dressed as she was. He spoke to me, thinking I was she, and I learned then how he loved her. At that moment I could have killed her. I could have killed him." Here there was another note in Hillerston's handwriting. "Again I say that the poor creature was mistaken. I did speak to her under the impression that she was Mrs. Larcher, but I said nothing that she could construe into a declaration of love. Her jealousy rendered her mad, and she distorted the idle words I spoke. She took them up in the wrong sense." "My suspicions were confirmed later on," continued the confession, "for I overheard them talking together. Yes, Francis Hillerston and your wife were in a corner together talking of love. I listened. It was mean to do so, but then I was in love and would have stooped to any degradation to have rescued him from her clutches. They talked about a dagger which he had given her to complete her dress. Aha! He did not think to complete my costume with such a gift. Mrs. Larcher took the dagger out of its sheath and together they examined it. She blamed him for putting an inscription on it saying it would make her husband jealous. Francis laughed and said that he would never suspect him. Then Mrs. Larcher slipped the dagger back in the sheath as she thought, but in reality it slipped down among the folds of her dress, and when she arose to go it fell on the ground. They departed, and I picked up the dagger. At once I looked at the inscription, and there it was on the gold handle. To J.L. from F.H. I was so enraged that I could have broken the dagger. I tried to, but it was too strong for me. Therefore I thrust it into my waistband and went in search of Hilliston to return it to him, and reproach him for giving it to Mrs. Larcher. I saw him, wrapped in his cloak, go out with Mrs. Larcher. He was seeing her home, and in a frenzy of jealous rage I resolved to follow. Margin note by Hilliston. It was not I who went home with Mrs. Larcher, but Jerningham. I was dressed that evening as a Venetian senator and wore a long black cloak. This Jerningham borrowed from me to conceal his fancy dress when he left the town hall. My wife thought it was me, but she was mistaken. I went home with Georges Larcher, as he knows. The confession continues. They left in Mrs. Larcher's carriage, and I, hastily wrapping a cloak round me, followed in a fly. When I got to the Laurels they were talking together at the door, and the carriage had driven round to the stables. I sat back in my fly, for the driver did not know who I was, and watched. I saw Mrs. Larcher kiss Hilliston and run inside. Then I went out of my mind. I was possessed by a devil. He came down the path and turned midway to look back at the house. I had my hand on the dagger. It tempted me, and I sprang out at him. He turned sharply round, and had I not been blinded with rage I would have then recognized him. But I hardly knew what I was doing, and before he could utter a word, I buried the dagger in his heart when he fell with a choking cry. I knelt down beside him, and withdrew the dagger. Then I heard a sound, dropped the weapon, and fled. Some little distance off I ran into the arms of Francis Hilliston. I shrieked as though I had seen a ghost, and told him I had killed a man, that I had intended to kill him. He explained the mistake of the cloak and said I must have murdered Jerningham. Then he saved my life. No one had seen me come to the Laurels, no one had seen me in the garden, so Francis took me back to Horston, and I returned to the ball without anyone having suspected my absence. The next day the news of the disappearance of Jerningham was all over the town. Afterward the body was discovered down the river and mistaken for that of Mr. Larcher. Francis advised me for my own sake to hold my tongue. I did so, and shortly afterward I went on a visit to a sister of mine in America. Francis refused to marry me on account of my crime. In America I married Derrick, the millionaire. He died, and I returned to London. I found Francis greatly in want of money, and as I still loved him, I married him. No one but us two knew who really killed Jerningham, but for your sake, Captain Larcher, I acknowledge my guilt, lest you should be found out and accused of the crime. I could say much more, but this is enough. When you read this I will be dead, and my last words, I swear, are true. I, and none other, killed Mark Jerningham in mistake for Francis Hilliston. Note by Hilliston. It will be seen that my wife was actuated all through by jealousy, but I swear she had no reason. I loved Mona, not Mrs. Larcher nor her. I saved her life because she committed the crime for my sake. I married her because I was on the verge of pecuniary ruin. I have nothing more to add. You can blame me if you like, but I consider I have acted all through as I was forced by circumstances. 45. A Few Words by Spencer Tait. When the case has been stated, when the witnesses for and against have given their evidence, when the counsel on both sides have delivered their speeches, it is then customary for the judge to sum up the entire matter for the direction of the jury. In this instance, I am the judge, and here is the Larcher affair summed up for the understanding of the public. It has fallen to my share to wind up the story, so here I set down such results as happened from the confession of Mrs. Hilliston. The immediate result of her death was the marriage of the widower to Mrs. Bessel, which took place, so to speak, when the latter was on her deathbed. She lingered out another 2 months, and died in the arms of her husband, at peace with all the world. Dennis heartily forgave her, and the only bitter drop in her cup was the absence of her child. Yet when Captain Larcher suggested that Jenny should be told the truth, and brought to say good-bye to her mother, Mrs. Bessel, with a self-denial for which I hardly gave her credit, refused to permit such a thing. She thought that Jenny would be happier if she was ignorant of the truth, and moreover Mrs. Bessel shrank from letting her child know how she had lived during these many years. At all events, Jenny never learned the truth, and Mrs. Bessel died without seeing her daughter. That she forgave Hilliston for having deprived her of the child is, I think, a proof of her goodness of heart, for there is no doubt that he acted selfishly and cruelly in doing so. But enough of Mrs. Bessel, her faults and virtues. She lies in Hampstead Cemetery under a plain stone of rose-colored granite inscribed, "To the memory of Mona Hilliston." So she had her wish at last, and died an honest woman. Captain Larcher returned with Carey to the cottage in Nightingale Lane, as he could not make up his mind to resume his own name or tear himself away from the bookworm life of 25 years. No one knew the truth save Claude, Jenny, and myself, for Hilliston being absent from England does not count. The vicar was also enlightened on the subject, and expressed much astonishment at the strange series of events which had culminated in the death and confession of Mrs. Hilliston. Unwilling to lose his old crony, he heartily approved of Larcher's determination to resume his usual life, and so the matter was settled. Captain Larcher will remain Mr. Ferdinand Paynton to the end of his days, and will still be a mystery to the gossips of Thorston. How great a one they can never guess. But a notable change has taken place in his habits. He is no longer a recluse, a misanthrope. When I am at the Manor House he visits me there. He is a constant guest at the vicarage, and may be seen frequently fishing beside Carey on the banks of the Lacs. Following the example of his master, Dennis Bantry also renounced his name, which he superstitiously regarded as one of ill omen, and called himself Carey for the rest of his life. If he was grieved for his unhappy sister, her life and her death, he finds consolation in the society of Mrs. Claude Larcher, who conducts herself toward him as a niece should do. But the relationship is not known beyond the walls of Rose Cottage, lest it might lead to inquiries, and Jenny is still known as the daughter of Mr. Paynton. That Claude should call Mr. Paynton father is of course only regarded as natural by the village. Has he not married Jenny, and does he not stand in the relation of a son to the old man? Thorston gossips think he is a most perfect son-in-law, and never guess that any nearer relationship exists between them. Of course, Jenny and Claude were married as speedily as possible, and I do not know a happier couple. Mrs. Larcher has quite converted me with regard to the fair sex, and plumes herself on her victory. She has the audacity to say that she will yet succeed in getting me married, but I think that is beyond her powers. Mr. Linton married them, and they spent their honeymoon at the Manor House, which I lent them for the occasion. Indeed, while at Thorston they invariably live with me, and I should be offended did they take up their quarters anywhere else. Not that they have any desire to do so, for Rose Cottage is rather small, and besides, the Manor is within easy distance of it, so that Jenny can see her father, or rather her father-in-law, as often as she chooses. Claude still goes to different parts of the world to build bridges and construct railways. Sometimes his wife goes with him, but she does not like to be so long away from Thorston. Paynton is now an old man and cannot live long, so Mrs. Larcher wishes to be near him as much as possible. Besides, the cares of the nursery take up her attention, so I think that in a few months Claude will settle down to business in London, and make his home at Thorston, as he always intended to do. There is a pleasant little place not far from the Manor which I have been commissioned to buy for him, so I really think that next year Claude and Jenny will take up their residence among us. The only person who disapproved of the marriage was Frank Linton, who accused Jenny of jilting him. This was utter nonsense, as she never had any intention of becoming his wife. However, the author considers himself badly treated, and has taken up his quarters in London, where he writes books and poses in Chelsea circles. But I do not think he will ever write so excellent a book as A Whim of Fate, Perhaps because Mrs. Claude Larcher refuses to tell him any more plots. She has a good reason for doing so, as the troubles which arose out of her finding the murder papers in the garret of Rose Cottage have startled her in no small degree. Still, as I tell her, she must look on such troubles as a blessing in disguise, for, after all, they led to her marriage and present happiness. But Mrs. Claude does not see the matter in so amiable a light. Finally, Hillerston. It is hard to say what has become of that gentleman. After the death of his second wife he withdrew from business and went abroad. There I believe he is still, and from what I hear of him at odd times he seems to have developed into a kind of wandering Jew. France, Italy, Austria, Germany, Russia, he has seen all these places, and is constantly travelling about, no doubt trying to live down the past. Whether he will succeed in doing so it is hard to say. After some consideration I have come to the conclusion that we have been rather hard on Hillerston. He did not love Mrs. Larcher, in spite of his wife's insane jealousy on the point, and I believe he was sincerely attached to Mona Bantry. The blot on his character is that he did not marry her when she first came to London, and seeing that he was in love with her, I profess my inability to explain why he did not do so. Perhaps it was on account of her low birth, or the circumstances which connected her with Jerningham, but at all events he did not marry her till it was too late for the poor creature's happiness. Otherwise, I do not see how he could have acted differently. Louisa Sinclair was guilty of the murder, but as she did it on his account and was wildly in love with him, it was to his honour that he protected her as he did. Whether he would have told the truth had Mrs. Larcher been convicted, I do not know, but as Louisa Sinclair did not leave for America till Mrs. Larcher was released, I think Hillerston would have persuaded her to confess openly in the event of a conviction. It is true that he married her for her money, but I think he was touched by her devotion and gave her some love. No doubt it was Mrs. Hillerston's remorse for condemning his father to lifelong seclusion that made her so kind to Claude when he was a lad. Now it is easy to see why Hillerston was reluctant that Claude and I should investigate the case. He was afraid lest the truth should be found out and his wife arrested. I was wrong in my surmise. Hillerston was not afraid for himself, but for the unhappy woman who had killed Jerningham in mistake for him. The whole mystery would have been solved years ago had Dicky Pentle spoken out as he should have done. But the fear of being shut up in an asylum closed his mouth, and so the case was at a standstill for 25 long years. It was strange that Jenny, who set the ball rolling, should have been the indirect means of avenging her father's murder, or rather of solving the mystery which concealed it. Had she not discovered those papers in the garret, she would not have been able to give Frank Linton the plot of A Whim of Fate. Had that novel not been written and published, Mrs. Bessel would not have read it, and thereby have been induced to write to Claude. Had she not done so, Hillerston would not have told Claude the truth, thence we would not have taken up the investigation and solved the mystery. It was Jenny who was responsible for the whole. After 25 years, the child of the murdered man unconsciously enlightened us as to the person who had slain him. Fate works in strange ways. But I do not wish to figure further as a detective. This one experience has been quite enough for me. The thought, the anguish, the trouble is too worrying. The next criminal case in the Larcher family can look after itself. I abandon the role of detective, and thus put the last word to my only criminal case. The end. End of chapters 43 through 45. End of the third volume by Fergus Hume. Recorded by Celine Major.